today we're going to continue. This is week 3 of our 4-week crash course. We'll continue where we picked up last week. So let's go backwards here. We talked about, we talked about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, no, 2 weeks ago, we talked about how the colonies declared their independence with the Declaration of Independence, 1776, and how the founding era, it's important to understand our government. It's important to know how and when it came to be. So we talked about the reasons those colonies wanted to become their own country, right? And they fought the American Revolution and all that stuff. Talked about westward expansion and manifest destiny, how they felt that it was their destiny to expand the nation across this land that at the time, it belonged to France and Spain and Britain. And so, but they felt that it was, definitely someday the United States would go across the country as we recognize it today. Marcia, thanks for logging in. So any questions on, if you've looked things over or thought about it a little bit, any questions on things we've talked about?
Well, I just want to say that I'm really interested in the Civil War, because I know that Abraham Lincoln, he was I'm gonna say I know he was the president during the Civil War.
Yeah, it's a super interesting time. I'm actually when I hop in the car, and sometimes I listen to podcasts. I've been listening to this podcast it was an interview. A guy wrote a book about Abraham Lincoln and John Brown. Now, we're not going to touch on John Brown today, but John Brown lived in the 1800s, and if you've heard of what is it? Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. You can go down there today. And in 1859, I think, John Brown and a bunch of his sons and a couple of free black men at the time captured the arsenal, the army, not barracks, but arms at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and they thought they were going to start, they were abolitionists, they wanted to see the end of slavery, and they thought they were going to start an uprising of the slaves in that area, West Virginia and Virginia, and ultimately didn't work. He was then tried for treason and hanged, but it's this podcast that juxtaposes, kind of compares that really a terrorist, John Brown was a terrorist, versus how Abraham Lincoln believed things had to be done. Both wanted to see an end of slavery, but they went about it in two very different ways. It's a super interesting time period, this time leading up to the Civil War, the 1840s, 1850s. We view ourselves today as a divided country. Everybody, everybody disagrees. Half the country disagrees with the other half of the country. But like things in the 1850s were crazy. And to go back to that time period, and of course the Civil War, when you have, we're going to talk about it now. So what happened? Who wants to summarize? What was the Civil War? What was it about?
It was about slavery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Nadia. Yeah, it was about slavery.
South fought for the right to have slaves.
Mm-hmm. Now, what part of the country owned, at the time had slavery? What part of the country?
South states.
Right, the southern states. So I think I have a map here. Let me skip Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so here's the map of the Civil War. Okay, 1860 is an election. Abraham Lincoln is elected as president in 1860. And of course, the fall of 1860 is the election. He takes office in 1861. I think just before he was inaugurated, you have 7 states in the Deep South declare, really, it's really an echo of the American Revolution. Okay, now, in my opinion, it's not as noble as the American Revolution. These southern states wanted to break away from a country in order to preserve slavery, which is obviously a terrible thing. But there are, there's echoes of the American Revolution. They seceded, what we always say, they seceded from the Union of States, the national union, right? They seceded. They declared their independence, and they said they were going to be their own country, the Confederate States of America, the CSA. And in fact, if you look on Civil War uniforms, like their badges and things said, instead of USA, it said CSA, Confederate States of America. They were declaring their independence, 1861. A few weeks later, after they fought some battles, 4 more states declared their independence. And so you have these 11 states seceding from the Union, the Confederacy, right? They viewed themselves as a different country. Well, obviously, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, says no. He argued that it was unconstitutional for those states to break away. You can't leave the United States. And so they fought a war. They fought a war to keep it from happening, just like Britain fought a war to keep the colonies from breaking away. Okay, there are a lot of similarities. Now, people in the South and people in the South at the time said this is just like the American Revolution. We are brothers with those the founding fathers who were breaking away from the tyranny of Britain. Abraham Lincoln wouldn't have seen it that way, right? You can make that argument, and you can argue against it, but that's what they were doing. They were declaring their independence from what they viewed as an unjust country who was not allowing them or was going to threaten their ownership of slaves. Okay, so we have the North versus the South. The North is the Union, we call it. The North is the country, right? America. And the South is the states, the 11 states that seceded or said that they were leaving the country.
我全部 mute 掉。
Oh, I think, did somebody else call in? Who is that?
微笑。
Are you there? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Are you just calling on the screen, or are you able to see and log in?
I use the cell phone.
Okay.
It's okay. I just want to practice my listening English. I
Okay.
just hear it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, we're looking at on the computer, we're looking at some maps and things on the screen. But if you're just calling in, that's okay too.
Yeah, I call in, and after class, did you record?
Yes, I am recording. Yeah.
If you're recording, and could you after class send me a record?
Yeah. Why don't you give me your
Grisha2000@yahoo.com.
Okay. Okay. I'll look that up, and I'll definitely I'll email everybody today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're talking about the Civil War. So we have the North and the South. There was slavery in some northern states, but it wasn't as important as in the South. The South heavily relied on the slavery of African Americans. The advantages in the North for the Civil War was there was a larger population in the North. They had more railroad tracks, which means you can get stuff around, including troops and supplies. There was more manufacturing in the North. There was more with a larger population. There was more soldiers, and they had the advantage of being the nation, right? Being the country of the United States. The South had some advantages. One, militarily, they had better generals, right? The nation's military split in half, really. The ones that were going with the South and the ones that were staying with and fighting for the Union. Some of the America's better generals went with the South, were from the South, southern states, and so they went with the South. So they did have a military advantage there. Historians pretty much agree. But they had a lot of disadvantages. They were an agricultural economy. So when it comes time to make guns and uniforms and travel around the country where the fighting is, it's going to be harder. And they were at a disadvantage. They were starting from scratch. They were starting a new country, right? That's, in their view, they were starting a new country. And so that's going to be a big disadvantage for the South. One thing people don't always realize is there was slavery in the North. There was slave states in the North. They're the things we call the border states. Here on this map, they're green. There were states that had slaves. Slavery was legal. Slavery was a big part of it. But those states did not choose to secede from the Union. So generally, we all grew up thinking, oh, slavery in the South, no slavery in the North. But there was slavery in the North. There were slave states that chose to not secede, chose to not go with the Confederacy. And we call those the border states because they bordered the other slave states. Okay, and you can see on the map those states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland. I don't think Delaware. On the tiny little map, it's sometimes hard to see. So just an interesting fact. There was slavery in some northern states, these border states. Okay, a couple of famous things happen with Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. You have the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the middle of the Civil War. 1863, the Civil War lasted 61 to 65. So this is right in the middle of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln writes and then, and publishes the Emancipation Proclamation, proclaiming, right, announcing the emancipation of the slaves. To emancipate, what does emancipate mean? Anybody know?
It means free.
Right, to set free, right? And that's, it's a word that people use today. To emancipate means to set free. So it was the proclamation, the announcing of the emancipation of the slaves, to set free. Now, it wasn't a big, historians don't view it as a big law that changed things. This really, truly wasn't the moment that all the slaves were set free. Some people celebrate it as that, but in my opinion, it wasn't that. It wasn't the moment that slavery ended. It certainly wasn't the moment that slavery ended. And I don't think Lincoln meant it to be like the freeing of the slaves. It was really a strategic thing in the Civil War, because it didn't say that slavery was over. It said that slavery was over in areas of rebellion. So if you live in the South, or a part of the South that was in rebellion against America, then your slaves were illegal and they should be free. But of course, if I live in the South, I don't care what Abraham Lincoln says about my slaves. So I'm not going to listen to him. So the Emancipation Proclamation really accomplishes nothing. It doesn't free the slaves. It doesn't free the slaves in the border states where Lincoln could free the slaves. The border states will listen to the president of the United States, right? But it doesn't free those slaves. It frees the slaves in the areas of rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free the slaves. And I don't view it really as my opinion, it wasn't a big deal because it was a strategic thing in the war. It wasn't the law that finally set the slaves free. That will come, and Lincoln will do that, but this wasn't that, So the Emancipation Proclamation, it's important to know what it is, but I think historically it's important for us to know what it is not. And it's not the moment that Lincoln frees all the slaves. Okay, that will come. We will get that. We'll get there in a minute. And the Gettysburg Address, you've probably heard the Gettysburg Address. Does anybody know how the Gettysburg Address starts? It's one of those famous beginning of the speech. I'm sure you've heard of it.
No, I forgot.
Anybody know?
I should remember it, but actually I don't.
The Gettysburg Address it's not a long speech. It starts 407 years ago, right? You guys have heard that before, probably. A score is 20. So 407 years ago, 407 years ago, that's 87. 87 years before this, I think it says 407 years ago, our fathers, basically what he's talking about, 87 years before 1863 is 1776. So Lincoln, in the way that one would give a speech in the 1860s, right? We're not talking about, he's not doing this over Twitter. This is a speech he gave in person. And so Lincoln's speeches are beautiful. Lincoln's speeches are well written. I think they're great to read. They're excellent documents. They work well as speeches. I think the way he wrote is amazing. But so, instead of saying 87 years ago, he said 407 years ago. It was just the flowery way that they spoke back then. And he starts by talking about 1776. What the Gettysburg Address is, it says on the screen, a speech made by Lincoln to dedicate a cemetery at Gettysburg Battlefield after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. So the Battle of Gettysburg happens, right? It's in Pennsylvania. It's kind of a turning point in the war where the Union starts to do better, right? The North, the Union won the Battle of Gettysburg. It was July 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. In July. In November, Lincoln comes back, and they, as you see in that drawing, it's not a photograph, but it's a drawing back then, they dedicated a cemetery for all the thousands of people that died at Gettysburg, North and South. And so he's dedicating that. The speech is to dedicate that cemetery. Okay, and that cemetery is there today. If you go visit Gettysburg Battlefield, you can see that you can go to the place where the Gettysburg Address was made. So it's a very nice speech commemorating the loss of life during the Civil War. And he argues, and the point he makes is, let's not let these men have died in vain. Let's continue to fight to win, to bring the country back together, and he kind of says to end slavery. Okay, so that's the Gettysburg Address. Neither of these two things are super, super important. Again, the Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery. And the Gettysburg Address, famous speech, beautiful speech, but it's just dedicating a cemetery. So it's not, it didn't change. The Gettysburg Address did not change history, right? And it was also like 2 minutes long. It's not a long speech at all. So, important to know, especially if you're talking about the Civil War and talking about American history, but not the biggest things that shake the world. So who wins the Civil War? The North or the South?
The North wins.
The North wins the Civil War, 1865. And then I said here, where's my thing of Lincoln? Shortly, a week after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln is assassinated. He's shot by John Wilkes Booth, 1865. And so Lincoln, who had a plan for bringing the country back together, he always said, we're going to win this war, and then we're going to welcome the South back into the country. We need to get our country working together again. because that's a super awkward, I mean, awkward isn't even the word. That's an awkward situation to fight a war against half your country and then try to bring them back in and be like friendly again and forgive the people, literally forgive the people that were just killing you know, your father and brother and fighting in the war. Lincoln had a plan. He had a vision for that. But then he's assassinated. So now he doesn't get to be the president. America doesn't get to have him as president after the Civil War. It was Andrew Johnson who a lot of people said did a pretty terrible job. So after the period after the Civil War, we call the Reconstruction period. So here's a little summary of the Reconstruction era. It was the time directly after the Civil War where they had to reconstruct, rebuild the country. Now, it's not as famous as the Civil War, but I think it's as important because, again, you fight this Civil War. If you want the Civil War to be over, you've got to have a plan for bringing the country back together. Because if you're going to hold a grudge and punish the South, all that hatred is just going to continue, right? So Lincoln and the next president and the president after that, they had to have a plan for bringing the country back together. Does anybody want to read this paragraph for us?
I'll read it.
Okay. Go ahead.
The Reconstruction era was the period in American history that lasted from 1863 to 1877, following the American Civil War, and is a significant chapter in the history of American civil rights. Reconstruction ended the remnants of Confederate secession and abolished slavery, making the newly freed slave citizens with civil rights guaranteed by 3 new constitutional amendments. Reconstruction also refers to the attempt to transform the 11 southern former Confederate states as directed by Congress and the role of the Union states in that transformation.
Okay, good. Thank you. So it's the reconstruction of the country. It's a rebuilding of the country, like putting things back together, but also the physical reconstruction of the South, which most of the vast majority of the fighting in the Civil War happened in the South. So their towns are beat up, their towns are burned, their towns are demolished, railroad tracks. When the Union Army came into the South, they would wreck the railroad tracks in order to slow down the Confederate Army. So the South was just like physically very beat up. So as a way of forgiveness and moving forward, they had to physically rebuild a lot in the South. So it's a Reconstruction period. The first thing that happens actually before Lincoln does die, right, even during the Civil War, he pushes hard to pass the 13th Amendment. So there's 3, as this paragraph says, there's 3 things constitutional amendments we call the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, 15, right? The first 10 amendments to the Constitution we call the Bill of Rights. There was then the 11th Amendment, 12th Amendment, I don't even know what they were. And then the constitutional amendments in the Reconstruction period, 13, 14, 15. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. Says that, you know, slavery and forced servitude is over. You know, it ends slavery. It explicitly, purposely ends slavery. So then the Civil War ends, and that applies to the South, right? So to bring those states back in, they need to end slavery. They can't have slavery of African Americans anymore. The 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment gives citizenship regardless of race. And that happens just a couple years later. And then a couple years after that, you have the 15th Amendment, which gives the right to vote to any citizen regardless of race. So very quickly, like within 5 years, you have, you know, if I'm an African American slave, I go from slave to free to voting, or slavery, you know, day one I'm a slave, and then I'm free, and then I become a citizen, and then I get the right to vote. That happens, you know, all things considered, happens super quickly, a couple of years, and you know, that's millions of people. Essentially half this population of the South was, some people, you know, in some areas much more than half the population was slaves. So now all of a sudden all those people are free, and then they become citizens, and then they become voting citizens. The men, of course, not the women. Not yet, not the women. You know, things happen this was extreme change very quickly. And so you have some serious change. Olu Wakimi, thank you for logging in. I see your chat. My name's Matt. You know, Rick sometimes does the social studies classes, but my name's Matt. So we're talking about American history today.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry for coming in late.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I will share, I'm recording this class. I'm going to share this recording. I'll email it out later. And if you want, you can watch that recording. Okay, so after the Reconstruction period ends in 1877, a lot of progress is made, but then they do take, you know, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You have, in the 1877, you have things kind of fall apart. Those African Americans, you don't take away their citizenship, you don't take away their vote, but you do start to see, the late 1800s, you start to see racism creep way up. You have the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings across the South. And so a very short period of great hopefulness after the Civil War kind of slides backwards. And we see that then through the late 1800s into the 1900s. You have, you know, unfortunately, the racism that we now recognize as a big part of American history. Okay, so now let's look at World War I. World War I we can talk about real quick because it really doesn't matter. You know, my bottom point there is World War I is mostly viewed now as pointless. It starts really quickly. The whole world gets wrapped up into it because there was treaties all around the world. And if my country has a treaty with your country, then if you go to war, that means I have to go to war and help you. And so it just, like, all of a sudden, World War I started. And frankly, we're not going to worry about it. It was in the 19 teens, okay, 1914, 1918. It was 100 years ago. The important thing about World War I is how it ended. What happened when it was over? At the end of every big war, they sign a treaty, right? Declaring an end to the war. And generally, the winners of the war get to punish a little bit the people who lost, right? We view them as the bad guys, so they have to be punished a little bit. The Treaty of Versailles, France, that was where it was signed, so that's what they call it. The Treaty of Versailles gave Britain and France a lot of control over what had been German lands, German colonies. Also, you know, the third point there is economic punishment of Germany. So what happened, the important thing about World War I is that Germany didn't like how it ended. Germany lost. Now, this is not Nazi Germany. We're going to talk about that in a moment. This is before Nazi Germany. But Germany was the loser in World War I. And so they did not like that they were being punished. There was economic punishment. There were, you know, some of their lands were taken away. America didn't play a big role in World War I, so we didn't really, it wasn't really our war to fight. And so when it was over, we just kind of pulled back, and like a turtle pulls his head into his shell, we just kind of returned to isolationism. We wanted to be an isolated country. We're not going to get involved in anybody else's problems. Okay. Now, World War I is in the 19 teens, right? 20 years later, we have World War II. So in the 1930s, in the meantime, between World War I and what, they didn't know it at the time, but World War II is coming. In the 1930s, you have the German people angry about how World War I ended, angry about the economic punishment and how they were embarrassed, right? They feel like they've been embarrassed on the world stage. And so a person named Adolf Hitler comes to power, and he starts low down in the government and works his way up through positions in the government. And he's promising the German people that he will return them to their former glory. Germany will be a world power again. Germany will be something that the world will fear and that we can be proud of. And he's making these big promises to the German people. Okay. And he gets his way to the top of the German government. He becomes chancellor. And then he says, and then he starts talking a little bit crazy. And he says, Germany is going to be so great that the world will fear us and we're going to take over the world. And for the most part, everybody around the world said, oh, well, we'll let that guy talk. It doesn't matter. Germany's not going to take over the world. But then in 1939, it says, Nazi Germany, the Nazi party that Adolf Hitler was the leader of, invades Poland. And then it invades, their army, the Nazi army, invades the neighboring country of Poland. And then it invades a little bit more in Central Europe. And then the world started to say, hey, maybe this guy who's talking about taking over the world, maybe he's kind of serious. And maybe we should not ignore this kind of crazy guy over in Germany. Okay, so then the world pushes back on Nazi Germany after they invade Poland, and World War I breaks out. Or I'm sorry, World War II. World War II breaks out. At first, America was not involved. Okay, it was over in Europe. We weren't happy with World War II. We're definitely not going to get involved now. So America stayed out of it. In 1941, it says the Nazis invade Russia, who they were friends with, but the Nazis try to take over Russia. So now Britain, we view, today in America, we would say Britain was the good guys in World War II. Now, they had been enemies with Russia. Now we're friends because the Nazis tried to invade Russia, breaking the treaty that they had together. So now Russia is on the side of the good guys, which must have been crazy. Okay, but still America's trying to stay out of it until December 7th, 1941, the bombing at Pearl Harbor. Now, Pearl Harbor is the military base in Hawaii, right? The middle of the Pacific Ocean, middle of nowhere, halfway between California and Japan. And the Japanese fly a couple hundred airplanes, fly all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Hawaii, to Pearl Harbor, and bomb the U.S. military base. The Japanese thought that they were going to scare America into staying out of the war. Okay, they were going to have such a show of force. They were going to terrify the Americans to staying out of the war. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declares war. Well, according to the Constitution, the president doesn't declare war. Congress declares war. So Roosevelt made a speech to Congress asking them to declare war, and they did the very next day. And so now America is in World War II, okay, because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we fight the war, okay. There's a lot going on in World War II. You could spend a lifetime studying World War II. We'll skip to the end, though. So the end of World War II, the Nazis fail their invasion of Russia, okay, they end up not taking over the world. By the end of 1944, the Nazis were trapped in Germany, trapped between the Allies, the British and the United States, coming from the west, and the Russians coming from the east. And so the Nazis were losing, and they were getting squeezed. And Adolf Hitler is in Berlin in a bunker hiding, and ultimately he commits suicide. Adolf Hitler kills himself. Nobody ever captured Adolf Hitler. He was in a bunker hiding in Berlin, and he killed himself in 1945. Shortly thereafter, Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. Okay, and so you see the guy holding up the newspaper. It says it's VE Day, which stands for Victory in Europe. There's really two halves to World War II. There's what they call the European theater and the Pacific theater. The Nazis, we were fighting the Nazis in Europe, in the European theater. Okay, but you have, we're also fighting the Japanese in the Pacific theater. So it's like there's really two wars going on. The Allies are fighting the Nazis in Europe, and in the Pacific Ocean in Japan and Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean, we're fighting the Japanese. Well, the war goes on. So Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, was May 8th, 1945. By August, 3 months later, we want to end the war. So we drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. They still don't declare, they don't give up. The Japanese don't give up. So 3 days later, we drop a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Japan. And so a week after that, Japan surrenders, ending World War II. So what caused the end of World War II? It was the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which brings us into the atomic age, right? And we'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk about the Cold War in a moment and how that was brought about because of the invention. America's, our scientists invented the atomic bomb before any other country did. And then we used it, which is, you can have a giant weapon like that, but when you choose to use it, that's saying to the world, hey, we're serious. You should be afraid of us because we have this ability and we will use it in battle. It's kind of crazy. The other thing to think about with World War II is the Holocaust. So what do we know? What do you guys know about the Holocaust? What does it involve?
Jews were killed all around the world, especially in Poland and Germany and Russia.
Mm-hmm. Right, millions of Jews and other groups, and we'll see that in a sec. But yeah, by and large, millions of Jewish people were killed in Germany and Poland and in Central Europe and in Russia. Okay, so a Holocaust means, really like a sacrifice by fire. It's actually a word that has a meaning before this time period. So like in older religions, you have a sacrifice. Sometimes you sacrifice an animal, like in the Bible, they sacrifice a lamb or something. And a Holocaust is a word that means to sacrifice by fire. And so it means, these millions of Jews were, some of them burned, right? And they were sacrificed, they were killed. So it says the systematic, this is purposeful, this isn't just, murders. This is the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. The Nazis and the people who collaborated or cooperated with the Nazis killed 6 million Jews. The systematic state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews. Also, gypsies, physical or mentally handicapped, homosexuals, political prisoners, anybody that the Nazis viewed as different or dangerous or an enemy for some reason, they would round them up, put them on, we see in this picture, put them on freight trains, cattle cars on a train. They would drive you to one of the concentration camps, and there's some that are very famous. Auschwitz, Dachau are the more famous ones, but there was several, and you'd be dropped off, and you would possibly do work, labor, making things, making shoes, making clothes. Or some were just extermination camps where you would be dropped off, and within a couple of days you would be killed in gas chambers or firing squads. Okay, and it was, obviously horrific stuff. Some were work camps, some were extermination camps where people were just plain murdered. The news of this didn't really come out during World War II. We kind of knew that the Germans were doing some crazy evil stuff, but it wasn't until the Allies, the British and the American troops, got into Germany, got into Poland, started to clear out the Nazis, take over the towns, and then we found these concentration camps and were pretty surprised by what they found. So they were known, but we didn't, this is horrific stuff. And so you wouldn't think that that humans would do this to each other. So they were pretty surprised by what they found, obviously. So that's an important part of World War II. When you think of World War II, when you think of the Nazis, Nazi Germany, you need to think about, be aware of the Holocaust as part of it. Okay. Any questions up until this point? We're zooming really fast, and that's what we got to do in this course. But any questions?
Well, I just want to say that now I looked at the map of the Civil War and about the fight between the North and the South. But I want to know, have you ever been to Virginia in the South? Have you been to Virginia before? Because we have 3 times.
Okay. Yeah, I've driven through Virginia a few times. I've never done a battlefield. No, I did. Well, my eighth grade school trip a long time ago. I think we did a few Civil War battlefields. Yeah. They're neat. They're really cool to see. Have you guys been to some battlefields?
No. Now what I was trying to get to was I knew 2 years ago when I was learning about the Civil War that the fight was between the North and the South. Now, when I heard about the Civil War, I thought that the South won, but I was corrected by somebody, and they said that the North won. And I said to myself, you know what? It was really sad back then that Blacks were being treated as slaves. And it's sad right now that Blacks are still being treated.
Oh, yeah. No, it's, we can, and everybody has a different viewpoint. Everybody has a different perspective on it. But, hopefully we as a country are making progress, but it's not perfect progress. And it's, there's things go up and things go down. Certainly, and the other people, have discussions about, well, how would slavery have ended had the Civil War not been fought? And to answer that, we can look to other countries. Britain ended slavery in 1808 or something, 1820. They ended it through just passing a law, and they didn't have to fight a war. So America has a very peculiar history that, like, part of the country was willing to fight a war, part of the country was willing to break away and become its own country in order to protect this just economic thing of, slavery. Slavery was it's much more complicated than this, but, it was an economic decision. I'm going to own my workers instead of paying my workers. And part of the country was willing to go to war to keep that. You know, it's crazy. American history could have unfolded in lots of different ways, but this is the way that it did. You know, it's kind of interesting. Now, the Civil War was 4 years long because the South did win a lot of battles, you know, and we're not focusing on the details of those battles and even the generals, but people, you know, you could spend a whole lifetime, you could spend 1,000 years studying the Civil War and the soldiers and the battles and the movements of things, and it was 4 years long. A lot happened in 4 years. You know, we touched briefly, because we're in Pennsylvania, we touched briefly on the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's, you know, some people like learning about the battles and the generals, other people don't care. But I think what's interesting about history is people's lives. I mean, those battles, strategy is interesting too, but, you know, how did people's lives change? And I think what's interesting is today we're worried that the world's changing so fast and people, you know, this and that. But the time before the Civil War was crazy. Lots of change was happening very quickly. The time after the Civil War, a lot of change was happening very quickly. And some people loved it and some people were afraid of it. Just as today, people like change and agree with some changes and disagree with other changes. So we can learn from the past. We can try to do better than they did back then, make wiser decisions on a small scale, on a big scale, you know. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to study. And, you know, on a world scale, we've lived in a very peaceful time for a while now, but I'm sure someday, you know, it's terrible to think about. I'm sure someday America will be in a big war again. And, you know, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, people will be reading about how we handled things and this and that. So it's crazy to think about. You know? Any other questions? So we talked about the Civil War. We talked about World War I, World War II. We're going to talk about the Cold War next. Any other questions about these topics?
Saying about future, not now. Do you think there is a chance America can get civil war soon?
I don't think, I mean, you know, in the news, you hear people mention it because we are very divided politically. I don't think so. When you read about the 1850s, like it was, well, the 1850s was different. What happened was, and let me jump back here, is this manifest destiny. The reason that the Civil War happened, you know, history can only unfold in a certain way, and there's always a million reasons why that thing happened at that time. The Civil War happened in the 1860s because of the expansion of the country. Okay, so we talk about slavery, and the South wanted to keep slavery. Yes, but you know, if we had 10 more hours to discuss the reasons behind the Civil War, the other reasons behind the Civil War is because, as we see on this map, you know, the gray land, Indiana Territory, Michigan Territory, Mississippi Territory. When America gains land, it's not automatically a state. In order for those territories to become states, they needed a couple of things. There was rules on how a state becomes a state. First, you needed a constitution, a state constitution. Pennsylvania has a state constitution. Every state has a constitution. It's a requirement of becoming a state. Okay, so as America expanded westward, these territories, they wrote a state constitution, they set up a state government, and I think you had to have a certain number of American people living in the state. Now I say American people because there was already Native Americans on that land. And so for better or worse, those Americans would push out, basically the white Americans would push out the Native Americans. And so they'd make it I don't know how they counted Americans at that point, but you needed to have a certain population, right? You couldn't declare Mississippi Territory a state if only 100 people lived in that whole area. As those territories became eligible to become states, the famous one is Kansas. As those, well, we could look at maps all day, but as every territory becomes a state, and they do it one by one every couple of years through the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. The question is, okay, when that new state becomes a state, it's going to change the United States government, because we're then going to have to give that new state, let's say Kansas is the real problem, the state that caused the real problems was Kansas. Kansas is going to get 2 senators, right? So it's going to affect the balance of power in the Senate and the balance of power in the House of Representatives, because now, all of a sudden, there's a new state, Kansas. That state, we're going to have to give them representatives based on their population, right? Maybe more representatives in Kansas is going to take away representatives in Pennsylvania, which means Pennsylvania won't be so powerful in the House of Representatives. Kansas is going to get 2 senators. And so are those senators from Kansas, is it going to be a pro-slavery state or an anti-slavery state? Are those 2 new senators in the Senate going to be for or against slavery? That's the question. That's the real danger that led to the Civil War. Okay, we think about, the South went to war to keep slavery. What made the South so scared about losing slavery is that as all these states pop in one by one through the 1800s, 1840s, 1850s, if too many of those new states are anti-slavery and every state gets 2 senators, then the balance of power between slave states and free states in the Senate, if too many of the new states are free states, no slavery, then they could vote to end slavery. Okay, so that's the real cause of the Civil War, is the new states coming in. Are they going to be slave or are they going to be free? Because if I'm in the South, let's say I'm a pro-slavery Southern senator, which is easy for me because I'm a white guy and they were all white guys. If I'm not pro-slavery. If I was a pro-slavery Southern senator and I'm seeing these new states come in and they're all free and their senators are free staters, anti-slavery, I'm going to start to worry, hey, maybe the Senate is going to get close to ending slavery, and I don't want that. So I feel scared. I feel threatened. I feel that my way of life, my Southern pro-slavery way of life is threatened, right? And so it goes hand in hand. It's all connected. That manifest destiny and, the famous painting on the screen and the map, the Louisiana Purchase, all this new territories becoming states, the question of, is it going to be a slave state? Is it going to be a free state? That causes the Southern states to feel scared that America is going to end slavery. And if Congress votes to end slavery, the South is in big trouble and they don't want to see that, right? So am I explaining well? Do you see the connection between that westward expansion and new states and the beginning of the Civil War? Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, thank you.
And that's, it's interesting. And so that's not happening now, right? So if we did have a Civil War, I don't think we will. I don't think the average American, frankly, I don't think the average American cares that much about any topic. There's no topic that's equal to slavery today, right? You take away slavery and the South is in big trouble. There's no topic like that today that threatens people. I mean, people are for or against immigration. People are for or against, you know, all kinds of different things. But there's no major thing that if you change this one thing, like slavery in 1861, if you change this one thing, half the country is going to be in big trouble. There's no topic like that. So no, I don't think at this moment today, you know, and the foreseeable future, I don't see us being in a civil war, because there's not the types of changes that, and well, to fight a war, you have to feel threatened, right? The founding fathers, when they declared independence in 1776, it's because they felt threatened by Britain. When the South declared its independence, really, when they seceded from the Union in 1861 to start the Civil War, it's because they felt threatened. People today may not like everything that's going on, but nobody's life and livelihood is threatened by anything. You know what I'm saying? So I think people are going to continue to grumble and moan and argue. Yes, I don't see that changing much. But there's no giant change right now in America that's threatening anybody. You know?
Thank you for giving me hope.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, people are going to continue to argue, but no, I don't see us going into a civil war. You know, because that moment in history, 1840s, 1850s, and then the start of the Civil War, 1861, that moment in history is very different than this moment in history. You know, America may change in the next 50 years. You know, history happens. We can't predict, you know, 50 years, 100 years from now, the world's going to be very different in 100 years, right? I mean, look at technology and everything. We can't predict what's going to happen. So this moment today is very different than the 1840s, 1850s, you know? So yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Nadi, because that's what led into the Civil War, was that changing of territories to states. And how does that affect? It all goes back to government. I like to tie everything together. It goes back to, how is our government made? And so the question is, if there's 2 new senators from that state, is it going to be a free state? And me, if I'm in the South, do I feel threatened by new senators coming in from new states? You know, it all ties together, you know. So I think all these periods are interesting. So next week we will pick up, I'll share this all today, and I'll email this out. Next week we will pick up with the Cold War. We'll talk about the Cold War and nuclear threats that we still live with today. The United States versus Russia in the Cold War, capitalism versus communism in the Cold War. We'll talk about nuclear stockpiles. We'll talk about the breakup of the Soviet Union. And then we'll talk a little bit about economics, geography. Okay, so we'll pick up with that next week and finish week 4 of this 4-week class. Okay, I'll send this out later. I encourage you, take 5 minutes over the weekend, click through the things that we looked at today, just remind yourself real briefly the things we talked about, and then that drives it into your brain a little bit more, and you get to learn even more deeply about, you know, you'll remember more deeply the things that we discussed. Okay, if you have any questions, send me an email, reply to my email later. Okay, any final questions?
No, I don't have a question. I don't have a question, but I just want to say real quick. This upcoming Wednesday, I will be taking my my HiSIT test. I'm going to retake my HiSIT test at 1:40 in the afternoon.
Okay. Well, yeah. Good luck. Good luck for sure. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Did I hear somebody else out there?
Yeah, gonna be next week, the last class in your 4-week crash course?
Yeah, next week is week 4. And then I'm going to repeat. Basically, it's every month is like its own course. So I'll repeat in November. I'll pick up with week 1. And anybody, you're welcome to come back and you can listen to it all over again. But I'm going to be discussing the same things, week 1, 2, 3, 4. So next week is week 4 of this cycle. Yeah.
This whole cycle, yeah, because my teacher wants me to go in and just take my social studies class, but I don't want to do it until I have the last crash course.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that would work.
He doesn't seem to think I need it, but I've seen things in here that I wouldn't have thought would have been there. So
Yeah. Well, that's
better.
good. That's good.
All right. Thanks, love. Have a good day.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for logging in. I appreciate it. Have a good day and a good weekend.
Thank you. Have a
You
great
also.
week. Bye.
All right. Have a good day.
All right.
Oh, I thought I ended. Hold on a second.